Good day, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world. And this is a huge shout out again to Fiona, who sent me some really interesting commentary. Now, it's important we put this commentary on record because understanding the African psyche is very, very much part of what this channel is all about, because it gives you an understanding as to why things are unfolding as they are. And Fiona sent me a lengthy article, which I'm going to put into one video because it's a very, very it's very relevant to what we're facing in South Africa right now. And it's called Zulu Customs, Superstitions and Beliefs. And she starts off by saying, in the late 1880s, by the time he was in his mid-20s, my grandfather, Alan Ross, had pegged out and bought 5,000 acres of prime grazing and indigenous forest in the foothills of the Drakensberg Mountains. Now, we have had some other videos talking about Fiona's history and where she goes into more detail about her family history from the times of Jan van Riebeck, who's being blamed for everything now, isn't he? Anyway, let's get back to the story. Anyway, Alan Ross bought 1,000 head of cattle and 5,000 head of merino sheep. He needed herdsmen, and since there were absolutely no indigenous people living in the interior of what is now KwaZulu-Natal, he drove his ox wagon with a span, or team, of 16 oxen, the 100 miles down to Durban, or Port Natal, as it was then known. The first settlement of Europeans and British to establish itself in the bay. He needed to recruit Zulu people, as they were known to be good with cattle. There were no roads at all, and the veld had plenty of lions, elephants and buffalo, among the other game which roamed in the Natal Midlands, until the settlers shot them all out. Their only legacy is the rivers named after them, like Lions River, Eland River, Bushman's River, and so on. He moved into his father-in-law, W.G. Brown's beautiful Victorian mansion called Monaltree. It is still there, now occupied by a firm of architects, and has been perfectly preserved on the Berea, overlooking the Bay of Natal, and began making inquiries. Missionaries were the best people to approach, as they were the very first white people to ever have ventured along the north coast up as far as the border to Mozambique, the neighbouring colony which had been settled by the Portuguese. Scott, here I digress a little, but I think it's interesting for those who don't know South Africa had 3 thriving neighbours settled by Europeans and what happened to them. Like Jan van Riebeck, the intrepid explorer Vasco da Gama marked the arrival of the Portuguese in 1498, who began a gradual process of colonization and settlement in Mozambique in 1505. After only 4 centuries of Portuguese rule, the then thriving Mozambique, which had extraordinarily beautiful, small offshore islands surrounded by pristine coral reefs and tropical beaches, which tourists flocked to from all over the world to enjoy, gained independence in 1975. It became the People's Republic of Mozambique. Shortly thereafter, only 2 years of independence, the country descended into an intense and protracted civil war between conflicting Bantu people and supported by the Soviet Communist state of Russia, which lasted from 1977 to 1992. The aim of the Communist Soviet Union was to destabilize the whole area, including South Africa, aided and abetted by the ANC. Cadres were taken back to Russia to be trained, people like Jacob Zuma and Cyril Ramaphosa, and then returned to their home countries armed with AK-47s and the means and knowledge to plant bombs in public areas. Nelson Mandela was one of these. Once the southern tip of Africa was in chaos, the communist plan was to take over by force. Now, just on the point of Nelson Mandela, this isn't some kind of conspiracy theory. It's a fact that he was basically the leader of the ANC prior to being imprisoned, and he was the guy who signed off on terrorist attacks on innocent people in and around South Africa. Many people died as a result of his direct instruction. That is not told by the mainstream media, but it is a fact. The entire white Portuguese population fled back to Portugal. In 1994, Mozambique held its first multi-party elections and has since remained an impoverished, diseased, and scarcely populated, unproductive country littered by leftover landmines and with no foreseeable future. Nearly 30 years later, the wretched population is still sitting and waiting amongst the devastation for the white man to come back and put it all right again. Hear that? Like Zimbabwe. The people who could actually make things happen, they've kicked out, and now they're in the proverbial. They can't even blame it on apartheid, as the Portuguese colony had no such legislation. It's only a matter of time before the Chinese arrive to help them. The Chinization of Africa continues unabated. Our other South African neighbour, Angola, also originally a rich and thriving Portuguese colony, suffered exactly the same fate, also orchestrated by the Russian or the USSR and Cuba, and has now been rapidly colonized by the Chinese, who are after the riches of diamonds, iron ore, gold, oil, and virgin farmland irrigated by the Koito River. This river feeds the Okavango Delta and is rapidly becoming depleted by irrigation and polluted by factories dumping chemicals and other toxic wastes into it. In 50 years, the beautiful Okavango Delta in Botswana, the size of France, so rich with game and abundant bird life, will be a wasteland. And, you know, you can go to YouTube and just type in Okavango Delta, Botswana, and you will see the most amazing videos of what that area was like, partially is still like, but not likely to be like that much longer. It's very, very tragic. The African Angolan population remains impoverished, and more than 26 years later remain huddled in the remains of war-torn ruins, waiting for the right man to come back and put it all right. None of them have benefited at all from Chinese colonization, rather the opposite, as some are being used as near slave labor. They have no future either, again, nor can they blame apartheid, as the Portuguese settlers had no such legislation. The missionaries were the first white people ever to have encountered the indigenous tribespeople known as the Zulus, a small nation of hunter-gatherers living along the coast beyond the Chigela River. These tribes also kept cattle known as nguni or scrub cattle. Beyond the Chigela River, before sugarcane was planted, the original landscape was that of the Umfolozi Game Reserve, right up to the Mkuzi Reserve. That area is thorn-felt, and among other vegetation mainly supports acacia thorn trees and grazing, which the farmers call soetveld or sweetfelt. There are no seasons other than hot and dry or hot and wet, and more importantly, that area is free of the tsetse fly as well as a deadly rinderpest, also a cattle plague, a devastating infectious viral disease of cattle, mainly transmitted by direct contact and by drinking contaminated water. It could also be transmitted by air. The rinderpest virus, or RPV, is closely related to the measles and canine distemper viruses. It has now been almost completely eradicated, although there are still cases of it in north of southern Africa. The rinderpest also caused utter devastation amongst the settlers, wiping out entire herds of their precious cattle and forcing British and Boer farmers alike, particularly in the low-veld areas, into bankruptcy. The Zulus had no method of collecting water by creating dams, nor digging the equivalent boreholes to reach the water table below. They would have to herd their cattle down to the river. mainly the white and black Umfolozi rivers, to water them twice a day. Their Nguni cattle can only survive in sootfeld and are not hardy enough for frost. If they had ventured further than beyond the Limpopo Mountains, where the countryside in the interior has seasons, they would have had to find a way to supplement their feed once the grazing had been frosted off in winter. Cattle are the Zulus' equivalent of currency. They are Iron Age people, one step above Stone Age, and had not yet discovered the wheel, as the missionaries explained to Grandpa, as they had no need for one. They lived in small clusters of beehive-shaped huts made of grass or wattle and daub, mud huts thatched with veld grass, and created a boma, or an enclosure of thorny branches into which they herded the cattle at night, to keep them safe from predators like lions, leopards, and hyenas. They carved wooden bowls and rudimentary spoons with which to eat, and made fires by rubbing sticks together. They were fascinated by the flint or spark method the missionaries had shown them as an easier way to start a fire. The Zulus hunted for their meat, as they wouldn't eat their own cattle. They were too valuable, and were kept mainly to buy wives. The more cattle a man owned, the wealthier he was, and the more wives he could buy. The women folk were more beasts of burden than anything else. They did all the work, collecting water and firewood, making fires, cooking their maize meal, porridge, building the huts, and giving birth to and rearing anything up to 12 children, often more. In a lifetime, from birth, female children were expected to do the same chores as their mother, even at 5 years old, balancing a heavy clay pot of water on their heads as they trudged back up hills from the rivers. The tribespeople preferred to build their huts on prominent hilltops, so they could keep an eye out for marauding enemy tribes. These raiders from other settlements would overrun a small cluster of huts, kill the men and boys, and take away the cattle, women, and children for their own purposes as free brides. They would also torch the huts for good measure. This, of course, created a problem for the woman, who had to collect water twice a day from rivers far below and carry it back for cooking and washing. The missionaries noted that when the tribe had finished eating, they didn't wash their wooden bowls, but put them just outside their huts for the cockroaches to clean out. They were amazed to see how well these insects did the job, however disgusting it sounded. I have this documented information in a book I've mentioned before, called The Cradle Days of Natal by Graham McCurtain, who compiled all the letters written by missionaries, the first white men ever to encounter the only indigenous group of African people called the Zulus. The missionaries described these people as K-word. Okay, I'm not going to say the K-word, but that's how they describe them. The old Egyptian word meaning infidels. The woman also scratched out a patch of earth close to the huts using a rudimentary hoe with a bronze blade they had made. They had discovered how to smelt bronze ore and made spearheads as well. They planted maize, which is known as mealies in South Africa. They harvested the ears, removing the kernels, and used a grinding stone to make mealie meal, from which they cooked up crumbly porridge called uputu, or pronounced putu. They also produced a mahewu, small beer, by fermenting the grain and pouring it into clay pots for the men to drink. They couldn't really get drunk, even though they drank copious quantities of it. The real trouble started when they were introduced to distilled liquor by European settlers, and their systems simply could not handle it. It drove them crazy. The same happened to the Aboriginal people in Australia and Native Americans as well. European alcohol poisoned them as they became intoxicated so easily and after so little of it. The women milked their cows and filling hollow gourds or calabashes with the fresh milk, then plugged the hole, left the calabash outside in the sun for 3 days. This formed amasi, effectively curds and whey, and the precursor of yogurt, which they ate with their uputu. I have to say that I grew up eating uputu and amasi sprinkled generously with a government sugar, the equivalent of demerara, soft brown sugar, and to me it's manna from heaven and utterly delicious. Growing up, I far preferred eating that type of breakfast at the kraal with my Zulu friends than sitting at our dining table eating bacon and eggs while my mother watched my table manners like a hawk. Now, I have to just intercede here for a second, because when I was in Iringa in East Africa, Tanzania, and I had a black nanny, and she used to take me to her little hut for lunch, and we had, like putu, but we had this beans and the sauce, and oh my gosh, it was absolutely incredible. It's the taste and the desire to actually have that happen again is just one of my things in my bucket list. I haven't been able to complete it. But putu and beans and that beans sort of like sauce, oh wow, I just love that. And I know exactly what Fiona's talking about here. Anyway, getting back to her story. Meat was a treat and had to be. Small game like antelope hunted with an assegai, a short throwing spear which the Zulu warriors used with great and absolute drastic efficiency during the Anglo-Zulu wars. The women picked umfini, wild spinach, which they boiled to eat with the meat. When a man needed permission to marry a girl he had his eye on, preferably sturdy, plump, and who looked as though she was capable of doing all the hard work as well as bearing many children, he had to go and see the father of his intended bride. There he sat with the older man in his hut, and they discussed lobola, the bride price. Even relatively quite recently, certainly when I was in my late teens, 20 head of cattle would be acceptable price for a good, strong, young woman. As my mother produced each of their 4 daughters, the Zulus on the farm rejoiced and congratulated my father on how many cattle he was eventually going to receive as lobola. He just shook his head grimly. "We are a Balungu, white people. I have to pay for 4 damned expensive weddings to get rid of my girls. No lobola for me." "How?" they said in astonishment, clapping their hands over their mouths in dismay. "So it is bad luck to have so many girls then," and he had nodded gloomily in agreement. When permission was granted and the father and his prospective son-in-law shook hands on the deal, that was a signal for the women of the kraal to bring in calabashes of amahau. Some of them the wives of the bride's father and any sisters she might have still living there. The bride-to-be shyly came in to join them, and kneeling obediently offered her future husband the first swig from the clay pot of beer she carried. Finally, a beast might be slaughtered and roasted to seal the pact and celebrate the betrothal, and everybody feasted and drank to praise the event. The bride had no say in the matter whatsoever. However, wives often urged their husbands to take on a second and even third wife, simply to share the burden of their day-to-day living as a Zulu possession. I got this account of the procedures of buying a wife first-hand from Makaya, our houseboy, as I watched him pack up a homemade bush buckskin satchel with smart clothes handed down by Dad. A typically curious child, I sat on the floor of his hut and asked endless questions about what he was going to do when he got to Impenjle on his week off. All our staff worked for 3 weeks and then went home for a week, and I always wanted to go with them as I longed to see how they lived back home. From birth, male Zulu offspring did nothing but be waited on by their mothers and sisters until about the age of 10, when they became herd boys and could be trusted to watch over their father's precious cattle. They got together in small groups of 3 to 4 and armed only with some stones, fended off wild dogs, those excellent pack hunters who operate in the daylight. It was their job to get the cattle down to the rivers twice a day, again throwing stones at any crocodiles lurking in the water nearby. Others were given baboon duty and had to guard the small crops of mealies from those marauders who would trash the entire crop, only making off with a few ears of corn and leaving devastation in their wake. Once the boys had reached the age of about 17 or 18 and became men, they were put on standby by their chief, Shaka, and later on Dingaan and Mpanda, respectively. They had to attend the king's kraal to be drilled as warriors. These chiefs always kept a standing army of all the menfolk under their jurisdiction, and until they were called upon to fight, the men could sit outside the kraals, backs against the warm walls, and drink amaweho by the potful. That's their native beer. The womenfolk waited on them hand and foot, bringing them their food, and then waiting until the men had finished eating their fill before they and the children had anything. Even in lean times, when women were pregnant and or breastfeeding and food was scarce because the crops had failed or wild game had moved off, they still had to wait for their menfolk to eat first. The men did no work at all. It was a foreign concept to them, and still is to some extent. Both my father and grandfather said it was, if they wanted hard work done, they would be better off employing the women, as the men were useless. When the first white missionaries arrived on horseback, taking an English-speaking Zulu servant as an interpreter, the latter rode a second horse, and often they had a third horse or donkey as a pack animal. Both were greeted with utter amazement and not little fear, as the indigenous Zulu tribes up the Chigela River thought that they had been sent by witch doctors. These new arrivals carried rifles, usually a Mauser, whose reliable and accurate German-made firearms that had been so effectively used by the Boers during the Anglo-Boer War. This was because they came across prides of lions and other predators in their travels, and also needed to fire at crocodiles when there were rivers to cross. They hunted small antelope for food and made biltong, having learnt the skill of preserving meat by the Boer settlers. These courageous missionaries offered beads, copper bracelets, and even cotton fabric to the suspicious chiefs as gifts, while they moved from kraal to kraal along the way. These were all exciting novelties, especially the copper, with which the women loved to adorn themselves. The missionaries also reported that all the tribespeople wore in the way of clothing was animal skins around their loins. As time passed by, even then, the Zulu began to look at the white man as a sort of cash cow, demanding more gifts, or rather, now bribes, in order to pass through their territories, and in some cases even insisting they were given the guns and bullets. Many a white man had to jump on his horse and flee for his life, along with his terrified servant, firing shots over the heads of pursuing tribesmen after they'd tried to wrestle all his possessions off him, including the guns. Some unfortunate missionaries were murdered, their frightened servants managing to escape on horseback to report the events back in Durban. Apparently, white skin was very much sought after by witch doctors for muti, and that still happens today, as I report on in this channel. Albino Africans in sub-Saharan Africa are being decimated by people murdering them and selling their body parts to witch doctors for high prices. The trinkets and other gifts were the first objects that the tribes had come across that weren't biodegradable. From their huts to broken clay pots and wooden bowls, everything they owned could be thrown away to disintegrate in the veldt. This explains why littering is so prevalent amongst Africans. They have always discarded possessions. We're talking about only approximately 200 years ago, in the late 1800s, right through up to 50 or more years after the settlers had made themselves a life. Since unlike the Europeans, Asians, and all other people living up north, where they had evolved to learn to store food and make provision for lean times in winter, if there was a drought or bushfire caused by lightning strike, the Zulu tribe simply moved on, driving their cattle to better grazing or nearer to water from the source that hasn't dried up. They had no need to make any plans for the future. They reacted to any change by migrating within the territories that could support their cattle. This explains why Africans, the Zulus in particular, have no foresight or planning. It is a foreign concept to them, and they have never learnt the consequences of their actions might not have a good outcome. Now, this is a very important point that I've raised in the past, and that is that in the Zulu language, there's no such word as maintenance. There's no understanding of maintenance. When we talk about Eskom and maintaining the power plants and the substations, there's no understanding of that. It's not in their language. And this is why in South Africa, nothing is maintained, because the concept is not understood. And as in this article from Fiona, I'm going to repeat this because it clearly sets out what the issue is. The Zulu had no need to make any plans for the future. They reacted to any change by migrating within the territories that could support their cattle. This explains why Africans, the Zulus in particular, have no foresight or planning. It's a foreign concept to them, and they have never learned that the consequences of their actions might not have a good outcome. Consequences, like many other abstract general notions or ideas, and I can expand on this later on with examples, do not exist either in their language, nor can you explain it to them, as there aren't words even close. No matter how fluent you are in the language, any attempt at explaining an abstract concept is met with total puzzlement. They live such a simple life that, rather like other bigger primates, they have no need to think ahead. They react to situations after they've taken place. Here is one example. I have actually watched one of our Zulu labourers sitting on a branch of one of our pine trees, which he was supposed to be pruning, and sawing away at the trunk end. I turned to Dad and said, "Shouldn't you warn him?" I was only about 5 years old and could see the problem. Dad replied, "No, let's just wait and see what happens." It was inevitable that once he had cut through, the branch and the saw would plummet 20 feet to the ground. Luckily it was a handsaw, not a chainsaw, or he could have won the Darwin Award. He landed safely on a bed of soft pine needles and seemed unfazed, although the rest of the men were laughing at his plight. It was neither the first nor the last time that happened, and the reason why Dad would not buy a chainsaw. The Zulus were effectively tied to where their Ngunu cattle could survive, and that was only on the northern coastal areas of Zulu land, now known as KwaZulu-Natal, right up in the northern part, north of Chigela River. They didn't own land, as they were semi-nomadic, or in some cases entirely nomadic, if there weren't any prolonged droughts. It also explains that they never owned land. They simply held it as hunting and grazing territory until they were chased off and sometimes massacred by another tribe who fancied that area for themselves. There was a lot of infighting by the chiefs and their armies over territory, and as I've stated before, many of them fled their despotic chiefs, or kings as they would like to call themselves, by risking their very lives to get Durban and beg for sanctuary from the white settlers in exchange for work. Apart from this huddle of indigenous Zulus who had been chased down south by stronger tribes in places like Zimbabwe and further north, and the Zulus in turn had chased the causes down as far south as they could, down to the Great Fish River, where they lived on the coast and ate fish and shellfish. There were only small pockets of what the settlers called pygmy bushmen in the higher reaches of the Drakensberg Mountains. To my shame, these little hunters were considered vermin and shot on sight by people like my great-grandfather and other neighbouring settlers. I remember that our Zulu cook, Masango, would refuse to touch fish in any form, including delicious brown trout Grandpa used to catch in the Umgeni River. He would throw down his carving knife and proclaim they were the same as frogs. Along with chameleons, frogs and toads are regarded with terror by Zulus and treated as if they are venomous snakes. His take on causes was that they were dogs of dogs and eaters of fish, said with vehement loathing. When they came up to settle in the Natal Midlands, my ancestors imported hardy Aberdeen Angus cattle from Scotland, and later on mixed the breed with Sementala, a Swiss breed, and a bit of Brahman, not too much. Otherwise they jumped every fence and got away. The latter two being much meatier animals, fetching excellent market prices. Thus they got around the problem which had thwarted any attempts by Zulus to bring their cattle any further inland. But naturally, when they wanted to employ herdsmen, they couldn't see or find any Bantu tribes living anywhere other than in northern Zululand or way down south past the Great Salt River, where the causes were. Basotho land, now Lesotho, was way out of reach and too inaccessible to be able to recruit labour there, although the Basotho tribes kept sheep up in those inhospitable mountains behind the Drakensberg. So when Grandpa wanted his sheep shorn, he would arrange for the shearing gang to come by in the spring. I loved the 3 weeks that the shearing gang spent on the farm, shearing our 5,000 head of sheep with hand clippers. This was a motley collection of up to 15 rough-looking Basotho men arriving in a lorry driven by a white overseer. Quite unlike our familiar and slightly more fastidious Zulus who looked down their noses at them with unconcealed distaste, these strangers had beards and rather shaggy hair. Our hardy merino sheep are the same breed the Australians keep, as they originate from Spain. They could endure high temperatures like our summer heat and produced excellent wool, which went for export to England. During the Second World War, South Africa supplied Britain with beef, mutton, salted butter, eggs, sugar, condensed milk, and many more essential commodities, which were in such short supply in those extremely difficult times. Grandpa sent lorry loads of merino wool, as well as truckloads of prime cattle and sheep to the abattoir, so they could be shipped off to be feeding the besieged British people who were on such strict rations. Dad helped by flying rather rickety planes over the coastline between Durban and Madagascar, looking for predatory German submarines that lurked along the South African coast like crocodiles, waiting for shiploads of supplies to leave for Southampton. And then Fiona concludes this particular chapter by saying, in the next part is how Grandpa had to form a tribe by appointing a chief, as democracy is another alien concept to Africans. All right, guys, please remember to subscribe to be kept informed. Ring the bell for the updates. Please like this video, please share this video, and above all, stay safe.